Chapter 3. The first person to come running into the krill was Sheriff Lawler. The light was rapidly fading here. He peered hard at the trio he found waiting and slowed abruptly. The bony fingers curled around the handle of his gun relaxed as he caught sight of Pat. His sharp glance ran to Taggart, standing there nursing his injured hand and cursing. "Well, what now?" the lawman demanded grimly. "Damn it, Jess, skip the details." Pat was unusually court. "You can see this man's in tough shape. You best get him to a doctor in a short hurry." It was true enough. Taggart's leathery face was pasty, and he was none too steady on his feet, the blood dripping from his torn hand in a steady trickle. He stared at Pat, and then turned to Lawler in a lurch. "You ain't taking me nowheres," he got out thickly. "I got plenty to say." Other men had arrived and hurried into the krill and gathered about. "All right, boys, some of you get him to Doc Barker right now." The sheriff paid scant attention to Taggart's gruff protests. "Take it easy, Pike," he called after him as he was led away. "Neither of us are leaving town. I'll see you. Don't be fretting." He turned back to face Pat with an unconscious alteration of his rather ponderous manner. "I must say I'm a little surprised at you, Stevens," he said heavily. "Mind telling me what set this fracas off?" Pat shrugged. "The surprise is mutual, Jess," he said with artless frankness, flashing his engaging grin. "But Taggart deliberately picked a quarrel, and one thing led to another." He made an expressive gesture. "What could a man do?" Lawler cleared his throat, scrutinizing him closely. Standing beside them, Candace started to speak, only to break off abruptly and stare at Pat in amazement. Lawler ignored her. "You swearing that there was no overt provocation, are you?" Pat's innocent expression was perfect. "I didn't do a thing to him." The lawman's comment was measured. "You're one of the few men that I'd let get away with this, Stevens. It'll keep till I talk with Taggart anyhow." Candace's hand came out in an impulsive gesture, stopping just short of Pat's arm. It had taken her a few seconds to grasp fully what was happening here, but she knew now that without any actual false statements, Pat Stevens had allowed the sheriff to gather that it was he who had shot Taggart. Nor did it escape her that, by his instigation, the flaggard foreman had been hustled away before he had a chance to spill the beans. That Pat had deliberately covered for Ray Morgan she could not help seeing clearly. What his motives were would be less clear, though. "Yes, Candace?" Lawler had noticed her start, but Pat's smiling inquiry was sincere. Nothing." The girl spoke hurriedly, smothering the words that were crowding on her tongue. Jess had his own non-committal glance at her face. If he was asking himself what was on her mind, he did not show it. After a few more words with Pat, he turned away. Candace waited only until he had drawn beyond earshot, her manner uneasy before she could speak. Another voice broke in on them edgedly. "Smart of ya, Stevens. Mighty smart." Pat glanced indifferently towards Sam Sloane and Ezra that were standing a few yards away. "First time you found that out?" he countered briefly. Salone's head nodded with knowing assurance. "Give us the lowdown," he proposed softly. "It was a smooth job of covering it up. All we need to know is what was behind it, though." Pat accepted this defiant reservation. "Cover-up?" he echoed colorlessly, as if failing to understand. "What are you talking about, Sam?" "You never shot Pike Taggart," the little man said flatly. "You know it, and I know it."
"Pat, it was fine of you," Candace broke in unexpectedly. "But the truth must come out, of course, as soon as Jess Lawler has his talk with that man."
"It sure will, you dang dunce," Sloane seconded. Pat surveyed all three of them smilingly. "Sure that, are you?" It was Ezra who spoke up now, peering at Stephen's hard. "You may have something there," he muttered. "Chances are Jess Lawler knows what's going on all the time." Candace grasped at his meaning as it came home to her.
"Then Ray is all the more obliged to you," she exclaimed. "But what led you to do such a thing, Pat?"
Pat waved a hand erringly. "Oh, you're all making about a fuss of nothing. Whatever it is you think I did, it seemed like the thing to do. Maybe we'll just let her go at that." Ezra and Sam would have had a great deal more to say had not the girl's presence deterred them. They did not intend for her to carry their frank suspicions back to Morgan, and she was not done yet, however, though.
"Well, surely Ray would want to thank you once he knows this," she declared warmly. "You must give him that opportunity."
"Oh, don't worry," Pat spoke. "I've been planning to have a talk with that young feller. He'll get his chance to speak his piece, if I have to go out of my way to give it to him."
"Well, there's still Taggart to be considered," said Sam gravely. "He won't like you, Stevens, when he learns your game."
Pat smiled confidently. "I don't believe he'll make any moves very fast for a while."
"No? Mighty tough crew behind that hombre. Don't be forgetting that," Sam put in.
Pat shrugged, said that he would overlook nothing. "I've taken my chances in the past. I expect I'll have to do the same this time." He put Candace in her buckboard and saw her safely off for the Bull's Head, her father's ranch, a dozen miles east in the Hopewell Junction Trail. With the crusty partners, he moved up to the Gold Eagle for a nightcap, and if the pair heckled him irritably about his suspicions actions, it all slid off his capable back. Ray Morgan of the Star Cross was one topic he flatly refused to discuss. But if he would not air his opinions concerning Morgan, it was not because he had none. The younger man had much in his mind during the ride home to the Lazy Mare. Moreover, the following morning Pat was up early. In the grey dawn he saddled and headed directly for the little Star Cross spread with stern purpose in his manner. The sun was an hour high and growing warm when he drew near Morgan's place. It was a fresh, sparkling day, in the brush a ripe dun against the clear blue sky. Pat paid scarce attention to this quiet beauty, scrutinizing with care the weathered clapboard ranch house under the cottonwoods and paying special heed to the sagging sheds. He saw no movement as he approached. It was necessary to draw quite close to look down into the little hollow, and he was not more than 100 yards away when a ripping sound slashed unwarningly through the brush tops near at hand, followed by a roaring crack of a carbine. Throwing his bronc sideways, he raced towards a nearby wash. Even as he slid into the shelter, a second slug whined over his head, uncomfortably close. "If that's Morgan, it's mighty plain he doesn't crave any company," he said to himself grimly, wasting no time in getting to a safe distance from the concealed marksman at the ranch. There was no pursuit, nor did he expect any. That it was not his plan to leave without accomplishing his purpose, however, became plain when he began circling in the hills, sticking to the Star-Cross range but giving the ranch buildings a wide berth. His mind was busy as he rode. He could readily understand Morgan's wanting no visitors after yesterday's events, but if it was indeed Ray himself who had fired those shots at him, it threw an entirely different light on the young fellow. He was soberly canvassing this possibility, driving on through the intervals of scrub brush and park-like meadowlands that fringed the hills, when, breaking through a line of trees, he came abruptly upon a scene far different from anything he had expected. Seeking water, a yearling calf had got itself thoroughly bogged down in the muck hole, and with a loose rope over his head, Ray Morgan was busily doing his best, with the aid of his cow pony, to help the animal out. Catching sight of Pat, Morgan froze watchfully, in obvious doubt as to what he had been expecting. He waited for the other to speak. "Howdy, Morgan." Pat halted, a respectable distance away, to note the predicament of the star-crossed calf. Ray's acknowledgment of the salutation was scarcely effusive. "That you doing the shooting down at my ranch a while back?" Pat looked at him directly now, showing a faint surprise. "Me? No." His denial was a grunt. "Well, who was that, then?" Morgan's voice continued curt and suspicious. Pat shrugged his shoulders. "Well, I tell you it wasn't me," he insisted mildly. "What would I be banging away at down there?" Morgan had his own brisk way about him, and thought upon thought leapt in his wiry mind. "What about it, Stevens? Did Candace get away all right last night?" "Sure, I saw her off last night myself." Pat's smile was disarming. "Take it easy, will you, Morgan?" Ray's alert glance rested watchfully on Pat's hands, refusing to lift to his face. His tone did not soften. "Why should I?" Pat showed faint resignation. "I will say I rode over here expecting to have a sensible talk with you, but if that's the way you look at things, we'll just skip it." At least he had Morgan's close attention now. The latter paused, his blue eyes slitted. "I don't get you, Stevens. What would you have to talk to me about?" The defiance was plain. Pat's manner grew offhand. "A matter of 6 or 8 lazy mare steers that disappeared off my range a couple days ago, and they were tracked straight to your star-crossed corral, Morgan, and later we picked them up a mile or so off in the hills." His voice grew stern as he ended. "What can you tell me about that?" Morgan stared at him for a long moment, as if petrified, giving no heed to the bawling of the miring calf. "Yours, were they?" he said finally, straightened in the saddle. Pat continued to watch him curiously without an answer. "I never rustled them, Stevens," Ray concluded, doggedly biting the words off. "Well, that wasn't what I asked you." "I don't know a thing about it, I tell you," Morgan insisted, his face closed. "I didn't steal 'em, and you can make what you want of it." "Hell, I never thought you did, man." Pat pretended strong impatience. "If I did, you wouldn't have got clear of that corral last night. I was hoping you might have something to suggest." "And what, for instance?" Ray flashed back scornfully. "That I told the rustlers they could use my corral, maybe?" Pat saw that he could get nowhere with this man in his present aggressive mood, and he shook his head slightly. "Naturally, I don't know what you're up against," he said, "but you're not helping yourself any, boy, by talking this way." Morgan's look was wicked. "Well, let me be a judge of that," he retorted. "I don't know what your object was in coming and helping me last night, Stevens. If that was your real aim, it's your own business. I won't bother to thank you, though, so don't count on it." "Oh, that's all right. Candace already thanked me." "Well, she did it on her own, then. It don't mean anything to me." Ray's tone was unyielding and resolute. Pat laughed. "You're a regular old lone wolf, Morgan. Far as that goes, I approve a young fella going it on his own. Just make sure you don't stub your toe. And if you ever do land in a real jam, you might remember that I helped you once," Pat added easily. "I might, but don't be counting on it," Morgan repeated. Pat turned his bronc and started away. Aware as he rode, the other was watching narrowly his every move. If he entertained any fear that Ray was capable of planting a slug between his shoulder blades, however, he would not have bothered. Glancing back, just before passing from sight on the little swale, he saw Morgan once more wholeheartedly absorbed in the task of saving the bogged-down calf. "I'd have helped anyone finish that job," Pat mused, pushing on his way. In Morgan's frame of mind, he'd have taken that a favor wrong. Whatever it was that rode the young fellow's hump, already he was being driven to dire extremities. And perhaps he was fully justified. Pat was satisfied now that it was not Morgan who had shot at him. What, then, was the explanation to that unprovoked attack? Pat hauled up at sudden thought. Could be the same dose will be waiting for Ray when he gets home. He thought about uneasily. But on second thought, he dismissed the likelihood. Morgan had heard the shooting, for he had mentioned it. He could not have remained altogether unwarned. Pat decided finally the other could take his own chances, that, only too plainly, was the way he seemed to want it. Half an hour later, it was another matter when, after picking up the Star-Crossed trail and following it towards town, Pat presently descried a rider coming toward him. He was not surprised in another minute to recognize Candace Cowan, mounting this morning astride a frisky sorrel mare. Seeing Pat, the girl came on. At her approach, he pulled off his hat with a ready smile. Now I wonder where you could be going, he opened up lightly. Candace's answering smile was brief.
You've been to Ray yourself, of course. Is everything all right?
Pat assuredly did not intend to allow her to ride unsuspected into the Star-Crossed today, nor was he prepared yet to tell her precisely why. She already had sufficient cause of worry over young Morgan, and he did not propose to add more and worse to her burden. That's too bad, Candace. He shook his head regretfully. At least I could save you a longer ride. That boy's not home today. Seems to be no use for you going on. She weighed that in her direct way, trying to fathom its full meaning.
Well, perhaps he's somewhere on the range. I must at least try to find him.
Pat spread his hands. Well, it's no use. 10 to 1 he's taken fright and steering clear of Jess Lawler for a day or two.
No, Pat.
She shook her head slowly and firmly.
That's not like Ray at all. Wherever he's gone, some clear purpose has taken him.
Her words were positive.
I'm certain he can't be far away as you imagine.
Well, Morgan, he is kind of bullheaded, Pat affected to agree. But you ought to know what's got under his hide. It's plain something has. He was confidential now. Some faint idea of what his trouble might be make it easier to help him. Candace understood perfectly what he was suggesting. Her headshake was firm.
You said last night you intended to have a talk with Ray. I'd rather he told you whatever he wishes to tell, Pat. That way, you may get more from him than he told me, which is little enough.
She could not forbear adding. Pat thought a minute, eyeing her absently. Oh, well, I have seen him, Candace, he said finally. I may as well tell you.
This morning?
Half an hour ago, Pat nodded. He never opened up at all. Wouldn't spill a single thing. Probably feels he has just as good reason to suspect me as anyone else.
But doesn't Ray understand how you helped him last night?
Candace burst out. Pat shrugged. Doesn't seem to mean a thing to Morgan, or at least he says so.
But that's ridiculous.
The girl was plainly exasperated.
I'll admit this much, Pat. Ray's convinced someone is trying to ruin him, and probably by driving him off the Star-Crossed. But that he should imagine it to be you and is any way guilty of such a purpose, well, that doesn't make any sort of sense. Oh, dear. Wrong-headedness won't cure his trouble. Wait till I've had a talk with him.
She started on. Wait up now. Pat strove to block her, recalling the rifleman laying in wait. I tell you, Morgan isn't at the ranch.
No matter, I'll find him, Pat.
Nor would she allow him to accompany her on foot of the way, declaring her wish to continue on alone. After giving careful directions calculated to lead the girl straight to Morgan, wide of the ranch house and across the open range in comparative safety, Pat was forced to let her go on. End of chapter 3.